2 floors below her, the whole of Ashfell was singing her name, and Sorrel had never felt more like a stranger inside her own skin. She stood alone in the Alpha King's chamber, while the feast roared through the stone beneath her feet. They were drinking to the peace. They were drinking to her, the last daughter of Lindenmere, the green and gentle land that Ashfell had swallowed in a single hard winter. And by moonrise she would kneel before all of them, and be bound to the man they called the Ash King. A crown of pale iron waited on the table beside her. Through the high window the moon was climbing, slow and patient, toward the notch in the mountains, where it would sit full and white and call her down to the right. Not long now. She pressed her cold hands together and counted the moon's climb the way her mother had once taught her to count her own fear, one slow breath at a time, until the trembling had somewhere to go. She had never met Corvin of Ashfell before, the day she was given to him. They had traded letters across 2 years of treaty talk, careful pages in a careful hand, and she had built a whole quiet hope out of that handwriting. Then she had seen the man himself at the gates, tall and scarred and closed as a locked door, and the hope had gone very small and very still inside her. Let him only be kind, she had thought. She would ask for nothing else. She would teach herself to want nothing else. To keep her hands from shaking, she moved through the chamber, touching what would soon be part of her life: the heavy furs, the cold hearth, a shelf of books read down to their bones. And there, behind a loose stone in the wall beside the bed, something caught the moonlight and threw it back at her. She should have left it. She would spend a long time afterward wishing she had left it. The stone came away in her hand. Behind it, folded in dark cloth as if it were both hidden and kept, lay a necklace. A single moonstone hung from a fine chain, round and pale as the moon itself, and when Sorrel lifted it into the light, it was warm. Not cool, the way stone should be in a cold room. Warm, as though it had been lifted from against someone's living throat only a moment before. It was a woman's necklace. It was not hers. Something behind her ribs went quiet and strange. She was still holding it up to the window, watching the pale fire move inside the stone, when the door opened. Corvin filled the frame. He had come up from his own binding feast, and for one breath his face was only tired. Then his eyes found the moonstone swinging from her fingers, and everything in him changed at once. The tiredness fell away. What replaced it was not anger. Sorrel had braced for anger and could have borne it. What replaced it was fear. "Put it back," he said. His voice was very low. "Please, do not hold that. Whose is it?" She did not move. "You hid it in the wall of the room. You meant to share with your wife. I think I am allowed to ask whose it is." He crossed the room, but he did not touch her, though he came near enough that she felt the heat of him. He took the necklace from her hand by the cloth alone, careful never to let his skin meet her own, and folded the stone away as though it might wake. "You are allowed to ask," he said. "I am not allowed to answer. That is the whole of it, and I am sorrier than you will ever believe." Below them the horns began, long and silver, calling the Alpha King and his new Luna down to be bound before the gathered packs. Sorrel looked at the crown of pale iron on the table, and then at the cold man who would not lie to her even to spare her, and she understood, in the way a person understands a thing all at once and forever, that a crown handed to you at moonrise can be set down again by dawn. She lifted her chin. "Then let us not keep them waiting," she said, and she went down to marry him, anyway, and they were bound beneath the full moon in the old way, before the standing stones on the high terrace, with near 1,000 faces turned up toward them and the wind carrying the smell of pine and cold iron. Corvin spoke the words. Sorrel spoke the words. When the moment came for the two of them to press their bare palms together and let the pack magic take, he closed his gloved hand around hers instead, leather between his skin and her own, and the elders traded a glance that Sorrel pretended not to see. It was enough for the treaty, a Luna crowned, A king bound, two banners knotted into one. It was not enough for the pack, and she felt them feel it. That small wrongness. The way a room knows when a note is played flat. Afterward there was more feasting, and Sorrel smiled until her face ached and drank almost nothing, and watched her husband across a hall full of people who were watching her. She was the last heir of a fading house. She knew how to be looked at. She knew how to keep her spine straight, while strangers decided what she was worth. One man did not step out of the king's path, and he did not fold his talk shut when she came near. He came to find her instead. Lord Farron wore his wealth quietly, and his ambition rather less so. A lean and smiling man with pale eyes that moved over Sorrel, the way a buyer's eyes move over a horse at market. He bowed exactly as low as courtesy required, and not a finger's width lower. "The Peace Bride," he said, as though tasting the words to see if they had gone off. "We had all of us wondered what Lindenmere would send. You must forgive our surprise. It has been so very long since the king troubled himself to want anything at all." He let that hang a moment. "Do settle in, my lady Crowns. Sit strangely at the first. One never quite knows how long it takes to grow used to the weight of it, or whether one ever truly does." And he was gone back into the crowd before she could shape an answer, leaving the words behind him like a scent she could not wash off. By the time the maid came to bring her to her rooms, Sorrel had learned 3 things about the court of Asheville. The first was that they had expected someone else. She caught it in the pauses, in the way talk folded shut when she came near, in the careful pity of the older women. Half of them, she thought, had come tonight not to welcome her, but to see whether she would do. The second was that her husband was feared far more than he was loved. Men stepped out of Corvin's path before he reached them. When he laughed once, briefly, at something an old warrior said, the whole table went still with surprise, as though laughter from the Ash King were a rare coin they were not sure was real. The third thing she learned from the maid. Her name was Bly, a small, quick girl with clever hands and kind eyes, and she talked the way frightened people sometimes do, to fill a silence that scares them. She undid the long row of clasps down Sorrel's back and chattered about the kitchens and the weather and the state of the North Road, and Sorrel let her grateful until she asked the wrong question. "Bly," she said, watching the girl's face in the dark glass of the mirror, who wore a moonstone on a fine silver chain. Bly's clever hands went still. For a moment neither of them moved. In the mirror Sorrel watched the color drain from the girl's cheeks. "I do not know what you mean, my lady," Bly said, and it was such a poor lie, so plainly a lie, that it told Sorrel more than the truth might have. "You do," Sorrel said gently. "I found it tonight, warm as though someone still wore it." "Whose was it?" Bly looked at the door. She looked at the window. Then she leaned close, and her voice dropped so low that Sorrel felt the words more than heard them. "We do not say her name here, my lady. Not in this keep. The king forbade it, and he forbids so little that, when he does, we listen." She swallowed. "There was someone before you. That is all I can give you, and keep my place. Please do not ask me again." She finished the clasps in silence after that, and left with her candle, and Sorrel sat alone in a cold room that was meant to be a marriage bed, and was instead only a room, with a loose stone in one wall and a warm stone behind it. And a husband asleep, she supposed, somewhere far down a corridor she had not been shown. There was someone. Before you. She waited for jealousy. Something older and sharper came instead. One she had first felt as a child when the tutors lowered their voices in the next room. The certainty that she had been set down inside a story already in progress, and that no one meant to tell her how it began. She did not sleep. Somewhere in the long middle of the night, when the fires had burned to red eyes in the grates, she heard footsteps in the corridor beyond her door. Slow, careful, a man who did not wish to be heard. Sorrel rose, wrapped a fur around her shoulders, and opened her door a hand's width. Corvin was moving down the passage away from her, a lamp shuttered low in one hand, and he did not turn toward his own chambers. He went the other way toward the dark north stair that Bly had walked her so carefully around earlier that evening. The one that climbed to a door she had been told, without reason given, was never to be opened. She watched him climb toward it. She watched the light go with him. And she thought, with a calm that frightened her more than any anger could have, that a woman who is not told how her own story begins will simply have to go and read it for herself. She did not open the door that night. Some cowardice, or some wisdom, held her at the top of the north stair, with her hand on the cold ring of it, while Corvin's shuttered lamp glowed under the gap at the bottom. She listened, and she heard nothing at all. No voices, no weeping. Only once, the faint bright chime of the moonstone, as though it had been lifted and set down again. Then she went back to her rooms, before he could find her there, and she lay awake until the sky went gray. In the days that followed, Sorrel learned the shape of her marriage, the way a prisoner learns the shape of a cell, by walking into its walls in the dark. There were rules. No one spoke them aloud, but they were as real as stone. Corvin would sit with her at the long table at supper, the whole polished length of it between them, and speak of the roads and the harvest and the restless lords along the border, and listen to her answers with a still, complete attention no one had ever paid her before. But he would not close the distance. When she rose, he rose. When she drew near, he found some graceful reason to be elsewhere. He wore gloves at every meal. He never once touched her skin. At first, she thought it distaste. She had braced for that too, but a woman learns the difference between a man who cannot bear to look at her and a man who cannot allow himself to. And Corvin looked. She would glance up from her plate and catch it, the dark weight of his eyes upon her, swiftly withdrawn, and each time it left her warmer and more confused than before. They talked. That was the strange mercy of it. Across that wide table, with the servants gone and the fire low, the locked door of him would ease open a crack, and something dry and unexpected would come through. He had a quiet, sideways humor she had not guessed at. He knew the name of every hound in the kennels, and the story behind every scar on his hands but one. He asked her about Lindenmere, about the green country of her girlhood, and he did not flinch from her grief the way kind people usually did. He let her be angry about it. No one had ever let her be angry about it. "You loved it," he said one night. "It was not a question." "I was the last of my line," she said. "They kept me close, always close, a treaty waiting to happen. The gardens were the one place no one was bargaining over me. The gardens did not care what I was worth to anyone." Corvin was quiet a while. "I am sorry it was taken," he said. And she believed him. And she hated that she believed him, because it made everything harder. She could have fallen for him across that table. She felt herself beginning to, and it frightened her, because every night he rose and left her and climbed, when he believed her asleep, toward the door that was never to be opened. So she gathered what she could. She was good at that. A girlhood of closed rooms teaches a person to gather. She learned the name at last from an old kennel master who had drunk enough to forget himself, a grizzled shifter named Halles who had served 3 alphas and feared none of them. Sorrel brought him wine on purpose and let him ramble, and when she asked softly about the one who had come before, his rheumy eyes filled. "Vesna," he said. "Our Vesna, sweetest Luna, these stones ever held." He wiped his face with the back of a scarred hand. "Lost to the moon sickness," they told the packs. 3 winters gone, the king has not been the same man since. My lady and I will thank you not to say I said so. Lost to the moon sickness. 3 winters gone. Sorrel turned the words over and over that night, and could not make them lie flat. A dead woman's keepsake she could have understood. A grieving man keeping a cold stone in a wall to remember a warm throat she could have forgiven, even pitied. But the stone had not been cold. She thought of the chime under the door. She thought of the shuttered lamp climbing the north stair 3 and 4 nights. Out of every 7, men did not visit the dead, so often, and so carefully, and with so much fear. The wrongness of it grew in her like a second pulse. And it was not only her own unease she carried. Now, the court had begun to count the nights. She heard it the way she heard everything, sidelong in corners, that the Ash King went to his Luna's door and came away again at dawn, and nothing between them ever changed. No true bond struck, no heir promised. A treaty sealed with a hollow crown was no treaty at all, they said, and Lord Ferrand said it the loudest, and the most sweetly of them all. Lindenmere had been swallowed on the strength of this marriage, and if it was only a painted shell, the lords who had never wanted peace would reach again for her broken homeland, and no one would be left to stop them. Every cold night that her husband would not so much as take her hand was another weight set upon that scale, and Sorrel could feel it tipping. It came to a head on a night of no moon. The pack called it moondark, the black hollow of the month when the shifters were at their weakest and their oldest laws bound tightest, and Corvin was more shut than she had ever seen him, grey at supper, barely able to hold himself upright in the chair. When she reached across the table without thinking, only to lay her hand over his gloved one, only to offer some small human comfort, he came out of his seat as though she had drawn a blade on him. "Do not!" It was almost a snarl. His back was to the wall, his chest heaving, and the look on his face was pure animal terror. "You must never, Sorrel, promise me, you will never touch my bare skin. Swear it to me." She stood with her refused hand still open in the air between them, and an old shame rose up her throat like cold water, and beneath it, for the first time, a hot, hard thread of something else. "You married me," she said. Her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that later. "You crowned me before your whole people, and you flinch from my hand as though it carries plague. I am owed a reason, not tonight perhaps, but I am owed one, and I mean to have it." He looked at her a long moment, and the terror in his face bled slowly into something worse, something that looked terribly like grief, and he said, "If I gave you the reason, it would be the last thing I ever did for you. Let me go on giving you nothing. It is the only kindness I have left." Then he left her, and climbed the stair, and Sorrel stood alone in the dark hall with her heart slamming, and made a decision. She would follow him. Tonight, on the one night, he was too weak to hear her come. She would climb the forbidden stair, and she would open the door that was never to be opened, and she would look with her own eyes upon whatever warm and living thing her husband kept behind it. The stair was colder than the rest of the keep, and it climbed longer than it had any right to, turning and turning until Sorrel had lost the count of the steps and the feeling in her fingers both. At the top stood the door. Plain oak, banded in old iron, warm to the touch, when nothing else in that tower was. She laid her palm flat against it and felt, faint and steady, through the wood. A chime, a pulse, a slow, bright ringing like a struck glass that would not fade. She lifted the latch. It was not locked. That, more than anything, undid her. He had not locked it. He had only asked, and every soul in the keep had obeyed, because a request from the Ash King fell heavier than any lock. Inside, the room was full of moonlight that had no moon to come from. It poured pale and cold from a single stone set upon a stand at the center of the floor, the great twin of the one Sorrel had found, ringing that endless bright note. And on a low bed, beneath a window that showed only the black moondark sky, lay a woman. She was beautiful the way the dead are sometimes beautiful, still and perfect and far away. Dark hair spread across the pillow, her chest rose, her chest fell. At the hollow of her throat lay the small moonstone on its fine silver chain, and Sorrel understood at last why it had been warm in her hand. It had been lifted from this living throat. It was lifted from it often. It was the one thread tethering the woman on the bed to the turning world, and the man who tended it climbed 3 and 4 nights out of 7, to be certain it still rang. Between those climbs he kept it walled in his own chamber, close, where he could be sure of it. which was how it had come to be warm in Sorrel's hand on the night of her wedding. Vesna, sweetest Luna, these stones ever held. Lost to the moon's sickness, 3 winters gone. Not lost, kept. Now you have seen, said Corvin from the doorway behind her. Sorrel did not turn. She could not. She stood in the cold, ringing light and looked at the sleeping woman and felt the whole careful house of her hope come down around her in perfect silence. She is alive, Sorrel said. After a fashion, you kept her. Her voice was very steady. It frightened her. How steady? 3 winters you have kept her sleeping in a tower and told your people she was dead. And then you sent across 2 kingdoms for a treaty bride to stand beside your throne and wear a crown, and give the Pax their peace, so that no one would ask why the Ash King never took another mate. I was the shield. I was the story you told them so they would stop looking at the door. Behind her, Corvin said nothing, and his silence was a yes. She turned then. She wished afterward that she had not, because his face in the moonstone light was ruined with a grief so complete that for one treacherous moment she almost went to him. He looked like a man standing on the lip of a great height, holding himself back from the edge by his fingernails. Sorrel, he said, it is not what you have built it into, I swear that to you, but I cannot tell you what it is. If I tell you, I lose you, and I have already lost more than one soul to that stone. Ask me for anything else. Ask me for my crown, my hall, my name. Do not ask me for this. You love her, Sorrel said. He closed his eyes. I owe her, he said, which was not a no, and Sorrel took it for the very answer she had come braced to hear. For a moment the ringing of the great stone was the only sound in the world. She made herself look at him, truly, look. The king who had listened to her across a long table, as though her every word were a thing worth the keeping. The man who had let her be angry when no one else ever had, who had said he was sorry her country was lost and had meant it to his bones. She had begun to build something, quiet and real, out of that man. Now she saw that she had only been building it again, the same fragile hope she had once raised out of careful letters in a careful hand, and that in all the years between she had learned nothing at all, nothing except how a person can be surprised by the very same wound twice. Long afterward, she would learn what those 2 small words had cost him and what he had been trying, in his locked and clumsy way, to keep from crushing her. She would come to understand that a man who says, I owe her, instead of I love her, to a wife he is fighting to save, is choosing the wound that will send her away over the truth that would keep her and kill her. But that was later. That night she heard only what she feared, and it was more than enough. She walked past him out of the ringing room, and he let her pass, and he did not reach for her, because he never once let himself reach for her, and she told herself that was her answer too. She did not weep. She was proud of that. Later, along with the rest of it, she went down the long cold stair and along the corridor to the room that had never been a marriage bed, and she sat at the window and watched the black sky begin, very slowly, to gray. She thought of the last words her mother had ever said to her, pressed into her ear on the morning she was sent away. Let them look all they like, never let them see. She thought of the green gardens of Lindenmere, the only ground that had never once asked what she was worth. She thought that a person could spend her whole life being set down inside other people's stories, the sheltered heir, the treaty bride, the shield, the shadow of a sleeping woman, and never a single time be asked what story she herself might have chosen. When the first hard line of gold came over the mountains, Sorrel rose. She lifted the crown of pale iron from the table where it had sat since her wedding night. She turned it once in her hands, feeling its weight, the small cold kingdom of it. Then she set it down in the very center of the bed he had never shared, where he could not fail to find it, and she left it lying there. By the time the sun had cleared the peaks, she was through the low gate on a borrowed horse, with her hood up and her face set south, riding for the ruins of the only home that had ever been hers. Behind her, on an empty bed in an empty room, The Luna crown of Ashfell lay catching the light. She did not see what happened in the tower when the risen sun touched the great stone. She did not see the clean, bright line open straight through the heart of it, or hear the endless, ringing note begin at last to change. She did not see Corvin fall to his knees at the sleeping woman's side as the reckoning he had bled 3 years to hold back began, finally to come due. She only rode and told herself she was free. She had never in her life been in greater danger. Lindenmere was not the country she had left. Sorrel had carried a green place in her chest for 11 years. The drowned gardens, the willows over the millpond, the hills where the mist sat until noon. She rode into the valley at dusk on the second day, and found, instead, a country of bones. The hard winter that had broken her people had never truly left it. The orchards stood black and unpruned. Half the cottages along the water had fallen in on themselves. Ashfell had swallowed Lindenmere, and then, having swallowed it, had let it starve. She had thought she was riding home. She understood now that home was a place that could die while you were away, and no one would think to send you word. But the old house still stood at the head of the valley, and a thin thread of smoke rose from one of its chimneys. And when Sorrel led her spent horse into the ruined yard, a door opened, and an old woman came out with a lamp held high, and stopped, and pressed her free hand to her mouth. Wenna had been Sorrel's nurse when Sorrel was small enough to carry. She was bent now, and gray, and half-blind in one eye, and she wept without shame when she saw who had come, and she took Sorrel's cold face in both her seamed hands, as though she could not believe it was warm. "They told us you were made a queen," Wenna said. "Away in the north, in the stone country, and here you are on my step, with a face like the end of the world. Come in, child, come in, before the cold does." There were only a handful of them left. The last of Lindenmere, too old or too stubborn to be driven off. They fed her what little they had, and asked her nothing, and Sorrel was grateful, past speaking for the not asking. She slept that first night in her own girlhood room, under a roof that leaked starlight through a gap in the slates, and for the first time since her wedding she was no one's shield and no one's story, only a tired woman in a cold bed. It should have been peace. It was not, because in the deep of that first night, as she lay on the very edge of sleep, something reached her across all those miles of dark. It came without warning, the way a draught finds you in a shut room. Grief, not her own, a grief so vast and so silent that it stopped her breath, and beneath it, threaded all through it, a fear that had a shape she almost knew, and under that, faint and unwilling and terrible something that felt like her own name being held very gently by someone who had no right to hold it. Sorrel sat up in the dark with her heart pounding and her hand pressed flat to her breastbone, where the feeling had come in. It was gone as fast as it had come. But she knew, the way a person knows, her own reflection, whose grief that had been. She told herself it meant nothing. In the morning she found Wenna alone in the kitchen, grinding something bitter smelling in a stone bowl, and because there was no one else in all the world she could ask, Sorrel sat down across from her and said, "Wenna, what do you know of moonstones, the kind that are made to hold something, to keep it?" The old woman's hands went still on the pestle, exactly the way Bligh's had gone still on the clasps, and Sorrel felt the cold drop in her stomach that she was learning to know as the nearness of a truth no one wished to speak. "Where did you see such a stone?" Wenna said. It was not quite a question. So Sorrel told her, not all of it, but the stone in the wall, warm when it should have been cold, and the great twin of it ringing in a locked tower, and the sleeping woman beneath it, who was said to be 3 winters dead, and the husband who climbed to tend her 4 nights out of 7, and would not touch his own wife's hand. When she had finished, Wenna set the pestle down very carefully, as though it had become heavy, and was quiet for a long time. "There is an old bargain," the old woman said at last, "older than your line, or his, older than the packs themselves. When a moon-blooded soul is dying, and the one who loves them cannot bear it, They can go out under the dark of the moon and offer a trade, a life held in the place of a life lost. The moon takes the dying one and does not take them. It sets them between sleeping, neither gone nor here, and then it waits. Waits for what? Sorrel said, though some cold part of her already knew. For its price, said Wenna. A life held is a life owed. The moon is patient, child, but it is not kind, and it always, always comes to collect. And it does not take the one who was saved. It takes the life that is dearest to the one who struck the bargain. Not the one they kept sleeping, the one they come to love most, after. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere out in the ruined orchard a crow called and called. So, while he loves no one, Sorrel said slowly, the price is never due. The sleeping woman only sleeps, and the very moment he lets himself love again, truly love, the one he has come to love most is the one the moon will take instead. That is the shape of it, Wenna said. She reached across the rough table and took Sorrel's hand, and her grip was stronger than it had any right to be. A man carrying such a debt would do a wise and cruel thing. He would take a wife for the look of it, and never once let himself want her. He would keep a whole cold ocean between them, not because he did not care, child, because he did. Because the caring would be the blade. Sorrel could not speak. The whole of it turned over in her mind and came down. At last, right side up, and every cruelty of the past weeks turned inside out as it fell. The gloves, the wide table, the graceful retreats. Do not. You must never touch my bare skin. Swear it to me. If I gave you the reason, it would be the last thing I ever did for you. Not I. Do not want you. I dare not. She thought of the grief that had crossed all those miles to find her in the night, and she understood at last whose it was and what it meant, and she put her face down into her hands, and Wenna held her while she shook. But when she lifted her head, it was not only sorrow in her face. Something harder had come up beneath it. For if the old bargain was true, then the crack she had not seen, and the change in the ringing she had not heard, meant the debt was already moving. She had not walked away from danger at all. She had ridden out from under the one roof where a man who loved her was spending himself night after night to keep the moon from ever learning her name. She had that thought on a gray morning, and by evening it had stopped being only a thought, for a peddler came down the north road, with his goods and his gossip both. The Ash King had gone, he said. Vanished, clean out of his own keep in the dark. No word to his council, no guard at his back, and the whole north was boiling with it. Lord Ferran, that smiling man, had stood up in the empty throne room and asked the elder houses a soft and dangerous question. What was to be done with a kingdom whose king had run off after a bride who had thrown down her own crown? The peddler laughed as he told it. Sorrel did not. She was doing sums, cold and quick. If Corvin had left his keep, then Corvin was coming, and a king riding alone across two kingdoms was a gift Ferran would never let pass. She went out to the ruined gate to watch the empty north road, and she did not like what its quiet was telling her. The riders came 3 days later out of the north, under no banner at all. That was the first thing that told Sorrel this was Ferran's work and not the king's. A man who rides openly wants you to know his name. A man who strips his banners means to do what he fully intends to deny. Watered ran ahead of them the way it always does. A shepherd boy came pelting down the valley at first light, and behind him, by noon, they could see the smoke where the outlying steadings had begun to burn. 24 men, the boy gasped, perhaps more, armed and mounted, and asking in every ruined hamlet after the woman who had been the Ash King's queen. Wenna's face went the color of old ash. They mean to carry you back, she said. No, Sorrel said. She had been thinking, cold and fast, since the boy's first word. If Theron wanted me alive at court, he would have come with his banners flying and a writ in his hand. He does not want me returned, he wants me gone. A queen who fled is a scandal, The king might yet live down, a queen found dead, on the road to her ruined homeland, set upon by bandits no one can name, is a war. It is the treaty broken with no blame that sticks to him, and Lindenmere left free for the taking, and the king shamed past all mending, for losing 2 lunas to the dark. She was on her feet now. He does not want me. He wants what my dying would buy him. There was nowhere to run that a mounted man could not follow, and no one left in Lindenmere who could lift a sword and still had the years to swing it. Sorrel sent the old ones down into the root cellars beneath the house and barred them in with her own 2 hands over Wenna's furious protests. And then she did the only useful thing left to her. She climbed to the high room at the top of the house, the one that looked down the whole length of the valley, so that whatever came for her would come to her, and not to them. She was not afraid, or not only afraid, and that surprised her. Somewhere in the last handful of days, the frightened bride had been quietly replaced by someone else. Someone who had lately discovered that being lied to for love was still being loved, and that a woman who is loved has something worth the fighting for. She watched the riders come up the valley in the failing light, small and dark and unhurried, and she thought with a strange calm that if this was to be the end of the story other people had written for her, then she would meet it on her own feet, with her back straight and her eyes open. Then, beneath the drum of the coming hooves, she felt it. The same reaching across the dark that had found her in the night, only near now, and closing fast. A grief and a terror, and a fierce bright thread of her own name, growing stronger with every breath, coming up the valley from the north swifter than any horse had a right to move. He had felt it too. Whatever passed between them across the miles ran both ways. And he had felt her danger, and he was coming. Do not, she thought, uselessly, into the dark. Do not come. If you come, you cannot help but reach for me. And if you reach for me, the moon will learn my name. The first of Farron's men reached the yard as the last of the light died. What happened after Sorrel would never afterward be able to tell in its right order. The door below going in. Wenna's voice raised somewhere, unafraid, buying seconds with words. Boots on the stair. The high room's door, bursting inward, and a stranger's face, and a knife, and her own body moving without her leave, throwing the heavy candlestand into his legs, the 2 of them going down together in the dark. And then the window was simply gone, glass and frame and all, and the cold came in like the sea, and Corvin came in with the cold. She had never seen him shifted. She had never seen any soul become the thing that he became. Vast and dark and utterly silent, all the closed and careful man of the long table burned clean away into something that moved through Farron's hirelings, the way weather moves through standing wheat. It should have terrified her. It did not. Even in the wolf she knew him, because the bond knew him, ringing through her now like the moonstone itself, and what rang through it was not rage at all. It was fear. Fear for her. Only, ever and always, for her. It was finished faster than seemed possible. And then, the wolf was gone and Corvin knelt there in the wreckage, a man once more, bleeding from a dozen places and caring about none of them, his hands hovering over her, searching her for hurt without once daring to land. "You came," she said stupidly. "I will always come." His voice was wrecked. "Are you hurt, Sorrel? Tell me you are not hurt." There was a sound behind him. The last of the riders, the one she had put down with the candlestand, come up off the floor, with his knife, close, far too close, driving it toward the unguarded line of Corvin's back. Sorrel did not decide to do it. There was no time in which to decide. She only reached, both hands, and seized her husband by his bare and bleeding forearm and hauled him down and aside, and the blade hissed past him into the dark, skin against skin. The first time. The touch he had spent everything to prevent, and the bond did not merely ring. It broke open like a struck door, and everything he was came pouring through it into her all at once, with nothing held back and nothing hidden any longer, 3 winters of grief and guilt, and a love so long denied that it had gone to something like grief itself, and beneath all of it, rising now, rising fast. A cold and ancient attention turning slowly toward the place where their 2 hands were locked together. The moon had felt it, the moon had learned her name. His love had woken the debt weeks before and cracked the great stone as she rode away. But love alone gave the moon no grip. It had needed this, skin bared to skin, to fix at last on the life it meant to take. She felt Corvin feel it too, felt the exact instant he understood what her touch had done. And she felt him make a choice in less time than it takes to blink, a choice she was far too slow and too new to the bond to stop. "Mine," he said, not aloud, straight down the open channel between them, to the cold presence, turning its face toward her, not hers. "The debt was always mine. Take what is owed from me." "No!" Sorrel screamed aloud, to the room, to the moon, to him, but it was already done. The cold attention swung away from her like a great door swinging shut. And Corvin, who had shielded her with the last of what he had to give, went gray to the very lips and folded down into her arms, without another word. He did not wake for 3 days. Sorrel brought him down from the high room with Wenna's help, and what strength the freed old ones could lend, and they laid him in her own girlhood bed, under the leaking slates, and there he stayed, breathing, only breathing, gray as tallow and cold as the valley stones. The wounds of the fight closed, and knit as a shifter's wounds do. That was not what ailed him. What ailed him could not be reached with needle or poultice, because it was not in his body at all. That was the cruelest gift of the broken open bond. It did not close again. Skin to skin had finished at last what all their careful nights had begun, and now the channel between them stood open for good, and through it, Sorrel could feel her husband being slowly, patiently, unmade. She sat by him with his bare hand held in both of hers, no reason left on earth to fear the touching now. And she felt the cold attention of the moon at its unhurried work, drawing him out of himself a little at a time, collecting on a debt 3 winters overdue. She did not weep, mostly. She had wept enough on the ride south for a man she had believed had scorned her. She would not spend more now on the man who had, it turned out, been ruining himself to keep her breathing since the hour she came. Tears were no use to him, so instead, she did what she had always done best. She sat in a closed room with a hard truth, and she gathered, and she thought. On the 2nd day, without opening his eyes, he spoke. "You should not be holding my hand," he said, so faint that she felt it more than heard it. "I know exactly what holding your hand does now," she said. "It is a little late for the gloves, husband." A ghost of something crossed his gray face. Not quite a smile, the wreck of one. "You found someone who told you," he said. "My nurse, she knew the old bargain." Sorrel tightened her grip, as though she could hold him in the world, by main strength. "You saved Vesna 3 winters ago. She was dying, and you could not bear it. So you went out under the dark moon and traded her death for a debt, and you have carried that debt every day since. And when they made you take a wife, you spent yourself keeping the moon from ever wanting her, from ever wanting me." Her voice did not break, though it dearly wished to. "You let me believe you loved a sleeping woman more than your living wife, because the truth would have finished me, and you would sooner. I hated you and lived, than knew you and died." "When you say it plainly," Corvin murmured, "it sounds a good deal more foolish than it ever felt." It was foolish. She lifted his hand and pressed it hard to her own cheek, so that he would feel that she was warm, that she was here, that the touch he had denied them both so long was hers now, to spend exactly as she pleased. "You beautiful, stubborn fool, you should have told me the first night. I would have found a way through it beside you, instead of running from you straight into the one place your enemy could reach me." Through the open bond, she felt it then, plain and enormous, and entirely without hope, what she had glimpsed in the shattered instant of their first touch, and had not had the time to hold. His love for her, a love that had never once expected to be permitted, and had gone on anyway in the dark, across a long table, night after night. It was the most that anyone had ever given her, and it came from a man who was dying precisely because he had refused, down to the very last, to let it cost her anything at all. "I felt you," she told him, "in the tower when you would not answer me, on the road, in the deep of the night. You grieved for me even while I was busy hating you. So, do not tell me now that you do not love me, Corvin. I have been inside it. I know its size." He was quiet a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone fainter still, and something in it had at last let go of a weight it had carried so long it had forgotten the carrying. "No," he said. "I will not tell you that. Not any more. There seems very little point in lying to a woman who lives inside my own chest." His fingers moved, weakly, against her cheek. "I have loved you since the night you told me you were angry about your gardens, and I found that I was angry for you, and I have hated every hour of it, because every hour of it was a blade pointed at your throat. But I am not sorry, Sorrel. Whatever comes now, I am not sorry that I let myself there at the end." Outside, the crows lifted off the black orchard all at once, and did not settle. It was the third day that brought the rest of it. A rider under a white flag this time, one of Ferran's heralds, sent south long before any word of the failed attack could have carried back to his master, insolent and unafraid, bearing a message the Lord had been too careful to set down in writing. Sorrel took it in the ruined yard, with her head high, and her husband's dried blood still on her sleeve. The Ash King had fled his own keep in the night, the man recited, chasing a runaway bride across 2 kingdoms like a lovesick boy. And a king who abandons his throne for a woman who threw down her crown was no king at all. Lord Farron, in his very great concern for the peace of the Pax, had gathered the elder houses. There was talk of setting aside a king who could not so much as hold a Luna. There was talk of a regency. There was talk, too, if the Lady Sorrel proved wise, of arrangements that might be made, for a widow of good blood was a useful thing, and the North would want a Luna it could trust once the present unpleasantness was concluded. Sorrel let him say all of it. Then she folded the unwritten message up small inside her own cold fury, and she smiled at him in a way that made his own smile falter and slip. "Tell your lord," she said, "that the Luna of Ashfell is not a widow yet, and that he has made a grave mistake in teaching me, all in one single week, both what I have and how very nearly I lost it. A frightened woman ran from that keep. You may tell him it is not a frightened woman who is coming back." She sent him off, empty-handed, down the ruined valley, and she went back inside, to the man dying in her girlhood bed, and she took up his hand once more, and she bent close to his ear. "Hear me, Corvin," she said. "You made a bargain 3 winters gone to keep death from someone that you loved. Well, I am moon-blooded too, and I am your wife, and I have listened closely to what the old bargain wants. There is a price standing on you now, and prices can be paid, and haggled, and paid another way by someone willing to walk out under the dark. You are not going to spend yourself and leave me the crown and call the leaving kindness. Not this time. This time we find the third way together, the 2 of us, or there will not be a moon left whole in the sky by the time I have finished arguing with it." His hand tightened faintly in hers, and far to the north, in a cracked stone in a locked and silent tower, the endless ringing note changed once again, as though something very old had heard its name spoken, at long last, by someone who was no longer afraid to bargain. The debt did not take Corvin all at once. That was its cruelty, and, Sorrel came to think, its single mercy, because a thing that takes you slowly leaves you time. He mended enough to sit up by the end of the first week, though he was a long way yet from the oak-built man who had come through a window out of the cold, The moon had begun to hollow him. She could see it in the new sharpness of his face, and feel it through the open bond, a slow, cold seep, like water finding its way out of a cracked jar. Some mornings, he was almost himself, dry and watchful, teasing her about her horsemanship on the ride south. Other mornings the seep ran faster, and he would go gray and quiet, and she would climb into the narrow girlhood bed beside him, and hold his bare hand in both of hers, and simply be a warmth for him to feel, because that at last she was allowed to do. That was the strange sweetness, folded inside the horror of it. For the first time since her wedding, Sorrel could touch her husband. She did not waste it. She had spent her whole life behind one careful wall or another, and she had no intention of spending what time was left behind this one. So she learned him with her hands the way she had once learned him across the long table with her words. The old scar through his eyebrow, the place on his shoulder where a boar had caught him at 16. The way his breath changed when she traced the line of his jaw, and the way the bond flared warm and startled every single time, as though after 3 winters of holding the whole world at arm's length, he still could not quite believe he was permitted to be touched. They talked, too, the way they always had, only nearer now, with no polished length of table between them. He told her about Vesna at last, all of it, in the low, even voice of a man setting down a weight he has carried so long it has fused to his spine. How she had been the Luna before, gentle and clever and loved by the whole of Ashfell. How the moon sickness had taken her in a single dreadful autumn, faster than any healer could follow. How he had knelt at her bed as the last of her slipped away and had not been able, would never be able, to simply let her go. So I went out under the dark of the moon, he said, and I offered it anything, everything, my crown, my years, my name. It did not want those. His thumb moved slowly over her knuckles. It told me it would hold her, and take its price later. From whatever I loved most when the time came, I thought myself safe. I thought there would never again be anything I loved that much. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her, and the look went all the way through her. I was a fool 3 times over, once for striking the bargain, once for believing I could outrun it, and once, worst of all, for you. Sorrel could not answer that for a while. When she could, she said only, "Then we unmake it. It cannot be unmade. Believe me, I have spent 3 winters looking." "You looked as a man who wanted her kept," Sorrel said gently. "I am looking as a woman who wants you living. We are not walking the same road." On the few afternoons the seep let him be, she took him out. The gardens of her girlhood had gone the way of everything else in Lindenmere. The box hedges grown into shapeless giants, the fountains choked with dead leaves, the roses gone back to briar. But the bones of the place were still there, beneath the ruin, and Sorrel knew every one of them. She half carried him down the mossed steps to the old sunken garden where no wind ever reached, and settled him on a fallen column in a rare patch of thin gold light, and told him which flowers had grown where, and which corner she had hidden in when the tutors came, and where she had once buried a dead sparrow with full honors and wept for a week over it. Corvin listened, the way he always listened, as though her small ordinary history were a thing worth the careful keeping. And because the bond stood open between them, she felt what her words did to him, felt the ache of it, that he was being handed at last the whole map of her, in the very season he was being taken off it. He never once said so. He only turned her hand over in his and traced the lines of her palm with one blunt finger, learning her the way she had learned him, storing her up against a dark he was still certain was coming. She felt that certainty in him, cold and quiet and sure. She set her jaw against it, and she did not let him see. She took her looking to Wenna. They sat up the long nights over the old woman's few brittle books and her far longer memory, while Corvin slept the thin, gray sleep of the fading, and slowly, piece by piece, Sorrel built the shape of a door. "A life held is a life owed," Wenna said, for perhaps the 100th time, turning her cup in her hands. That is the whole law of it. The moon holds the sleeping one. The moon is owed a life for the holding. So the debt exists, Sorrel said slowly, feeling her way. Only, for so long as the moon is holding something, the debt is the rent on the sleeping woman. And if there were no sleeper left to hold, Wenna went very still. Then there would be nothing to owe for, the old woman finished. Her ruined eyes came up. Child, you are speaking of giving her back, of letting the moon finish what it began 3 winters gone. If the held life were freely surrendered, freely, mind, with no grasping and no grief held back, then the moon would have nothing left to keep, and a creditor with nothing in hand has nothing owed. The debt would simply cease. The kitchen fire popped. Out in the dark, the wind walked through the dead orchard. Vesna would die, Sorrel said. Vesna died 3 winters ago, Wenna said, not unkindly. What sleeps in that tower is not a living woman, child. It is a death that a grieving man would not permit to finish. That is a hard thing to say, and a harder thing to hear, but you asked me for a door, and that is the only door there is. Someone bound to the bargain must stand under the dark moon and give the sleeper back with a whole heart, wanting nothing at all in return. And there is only one soul now living who is bound tightly enough to the man who made that bargain to stand in his place and do such a deed. Sorrel looked down at her own 2 hands. She thought of the beautiful sleeping woman in the ringing tower, the small moonstone warm at her throat, and she felt no jealousy at all now, only a great and aching pity, for Vesna, and for the man who had loved her past all sense, and for herself, who would have to be the one to open her hands and let a stranger go. He will never allow it, she said. He would sooner die than let her be given up. He has already proven exactly that. Then, said Wenna, you had best find a way to make the stubborn fool choose living, before the moon finishes choosing for him. And be quick about it, my girl. Look at him. Whatever you mean to do, you have days, not weeks. Sorrel went and stood in the doorway of the little room where her husband slept, gray and diminished in her girlhood bed, one scarred hand open on the coverlet, as though even in sleep it reached for a warmth it had spent 3 winters forbidding itself. Days, not weeks. She had the door at last. Now she had only to get a dying man to walk through it, and to do that she would have to ask him to bury, with his own 2 hands, the very woman he had bankrupted his soul to keep. The world would not give her even those few days in peace. They were 3 mornings into her searching when a rider came down the north road on a lathered horse, a boy from one of the border steadings who had ridden 2 nights without stopping. Lord Farron had not waited on the elder houses to make him regent, with the king proved dead or proved gone, which in the north had come to mean the same thing. Farron had simply taken the seat and dared the rest of them to unseat him. And his first act from it, the boy gasped, was to send a column of armed men south, to secure the leaderless province of Lindenmere for the crown, and to bring the widowed Luna safely home, whether the widowed Luna wished to come or not. Sorrel stood in the ruined yard with the news, and did her cold, quick sums a week, perhaps less, before Farron's men were in the valley, a dying husband who could not sit a horse. A door that opened only under the dark of the moon, which was still 4 nights off, 2 fires, and a bare handful of days in which to put out either. She did not let the boy see any of that on her face. She fed him, and thanked him, and sent him to sleep in the warm, and then she went back inside to fight the fire she could reach. She did not go at Corvin head on. She had learned that much of her husband. Push the man toward a door, and he would set his heels and die in front of it, out of the pure conviction that his dying was the kindest gift he had left to give. So instead, on the nights he had the strength for it, she simply loved him, and let the loving make its own slow argument. It was on such a night that the bond finished forming. They had not meant it to happen, or she had not, though afterwards she thought some part of her had meant it all along. He was having a good evening. The seep had slowed, there was color in his face, and he had laughed, Truly laughed, the rare coin of it, spent freely at last with no court to spend it for. She leaned in to be nearer the sound, and he lifted his hand to her face, bare palm to bare cheek. No leather, no rule, no fear left standing between them, and the laugh went quiet, and then, gently, his mouth found hers. Some animal part of her braced for the cold attention to come, the old punishment for letting herself care for him. It did not come. The debt was wholly his now, and there was nothing left to fear in being close to him, and so she let herself be held, and he held her as though she were a comfort long forbidden him, and finally allowed. She could not have said afterward, the precise moment the bond went from open to whole, there was no thunderclap. It was quieter and far larger than that. It was the difference between a door standing open in a wall and there being no wall at all. Somewhere in the warmth and the closeness of it, she stopped being able to find the seam between his heart and her own, and she understood with a certainty that needed no proof and was itself the only proof that ever mattered, that this was real, that he was hers and she was his, not by treaty, not by crown, not by any bargain struck in any dark, but by the plain fact of two souls that had chosen, against all sense and every wall, to belong to one another. Mine, she thought, the way he had once flung the word at the moon, only now it was not a shield thrown up between a loved life and its ruin. Now it was a vow. She felt him receive it. She felt, through the seamless place where they now met, his wonder and his terror, and beneath both of them, blazing a joy so total it frightened her, because she knew what it was costing him to let himself feel it, and she knew that he knew, and that he had reached for it anyway. For a long while afterward, they sat together by the low fire under the leaking slates, her head against his shoulder and his arm around her, and she felt his heart beating slow and warm beside her, and let herself have, for the length of a single night, the nearness she had been so long denied. Then, because she loved him, she began to fight for it. "You feel it," she said into the dark. "What is between us now? You cannot pretend it is a treaty match any longer. It is done. It is whole. I feel it." His arm tightened around her. "It is the finest thing I have ever been given, and I am going to have to leave it. And I have made what peace with that I can. So please, Sorrel, do not. There is a way. You do not have to leave it at all." He went very still against her. So she told him. All of it. The rent on the sleeper, the debt that lived only so long as the moon was made to hold, what should have been let fall, the door that Wenna had found in the deep of the old books. She felt him understand it as she spoke, felt the exact instant he saw what the door would cost, and felt him close against it like a fist. "No," he said. "Corvin, no." He sat up, gray in the starlight, shaking. "You are asking me to kill her, to climb that stair and lift that stone from her throat, and let her die, after everything, after all of it, after what I gave to keep her. I am asking you to let her rest," Sorrel said. "She has been dying for 3 winters, my love. You did not save her, you only stopped the clock on her. She does not live in that tower. She only waits there, and you are the one thing in all the world that will not let her go, and it is killing you, and it very nearly killed me too." She caught his ruined face in both her hands. "You did not make that bargain out of love. You made it because you could not bear the quiet. Love would have held her hand and let her go. I know, because that is exactly what I am prepared to do for you, and I would rather cut off my own hands than do it." He turned his face away from her, toward the cold hearth, and for a long moment said nothing at all, and she felt through the open bond the war being fought inside him, 3 winters of grief, lined up like a wall against the single new and terrible year of loving her. "You do not know what you are asking," he said at last. "You did not watch her die the first time. I did. I held the whole weight of it in my 2 arms, and I swore, on everything that I was, that I would never hold that weight again." "I know precisely what I am asking," Sorrel said. "I am asking you to be braver than you were 3 winters ago, not stronger. You were always strong. Strength was never once the trouble with you. I am asking you to be brave enough to grieve, instead of only brave enough to bargain. They are not the same courage, my love, and you have let yourself have but the one. He wept then, 3 winters of it, all at once in the dark, and she held him through the whole of it, and did not once loosen her arms, because that was the thing she could give him that the moon never could. When it had passed, he was quiet a very long time. Then he said, in a voice scraped down to almost nothing, "Give me until the dark moon. Let me sit with it. If I am to bury her, I will not do it as a coward, in a rush to save my own skin. Give me that much. Give her that much." And Sorrel, who understood grief, and who trusted the man she loved, said yes. It was the last mistake she made in the whole of the affair, and she would not forgive herself for it quickly. Because 2 nights before the dark of the moon, she woke to a cold place in the bed beside her and a silence where his heartbeat had learned to live in her chest. And she knew, before her eyes were fully open, that he had lied to her with the last of his strength, and gone out alone into the night to hand the moon, the only life he had ever truly been willing to spend, his own. Sorrel did not stop for boots or a cloak, or Wenna's cry rising behind her in the dark. The bond was a thread hooked fast behind her breastbone, and it was paying out into the night far too quickly, thinning, going faint, and she followed it out of the house and across the black orchard and up the cold hill above the valley, the way you follow the last of your own blood out of your body. She knew where he would go. Every moon-blooded land has its old place, its stone, or its spring where the sky comes down close. And Lindenmere's was the ring of leaning stones on the hilltop where her own people had struck their bargains and spoken their vows since before there were kings to forbid such things. She had played among those stones as a hidden child, and thought them only stones. She had never once imagined she would climb to them barefoot in the middle of the night, to argue a man out of dying. Her feet found the old path without her, over roots and cold, wet stone, while the thread behind her breastbone grew thinner with every stride. Twice she felt it gutter almost to nothing, and each time her own heart stopped with it, and each time she reached down that fraying line with everything she had, and held him in the world by the sheer brute force of wanting. "Stay," she told him, without words, running. "Stay. Do not you dare finish this before I reach you." And the thread held, barely, and drew her on up the black shoulder of the hill. He was there. Of course he was there. On his knees, in the center of the ring. With the last cruel paring of the old moon above him, his face turned up, his arms fallen open, offering. And the cold presence was already down there with him, vast and unhurried and almost tender now, bending low toward the life that was at last being freely, foolishly given. "Corvin," her voice broke across the hilltop. "Do not you dare. Go back." He did not turn. His voice was already half gone, worn to the very edge of the wind. "It is nearly done. She will wake. You will live. It is the only sum that comes out clean, Sorrel. I have checked it 1,000 ways." "You checked it as a man who has always thought his own life the cheapest thing on the table." She was moving as she spoke, into the ring, into the cold, that turned its terrible slow attention toward her, and she made herself walk on into it, and not care. "You do not get to leave me the crown and call the leaving a kindness. I told you that once already. You do not get to decide, all alone in the dark, that every soul you love is worth more than you are. That is not love, Corvin. That is only the old cowardice wearing a nobler coat than it has earned." That reached him. She felt it land through the fraying bond. He turned, and his face, in the thin light, was the face of a man being pulled apart, down the middle. "I cannot let her die," he whispered, "and I cannot let you. Sorrel, I have turned it every way there is. There is no third thing. There is. There always was. You were only ever too afraid to pick it up." She crossed the last of the distance, and dropped to her knees in front of him, and took his cold face in her warm hands, and opened the bond as wide as it would go, so he could feel she was not afraid, or that she was badly, and had come anyway. "Give her back," she said, "not to save yourself. Do it as the last and truest thing you will ever do for her. 3 winters you have kept her from her rest, because you could not stand the quiet where she used to be. That is not a gift, my love. That is a cage you built for the 2 of you and painted over with the word devotion. Let her go. Let her, finally go. And then turn and live in the loud and imperfect world with me, and let that be how you honor her, instead of this endless holding shut of a door that was always meant to be allowed to close." He was shaking so hard she could barely hold him. The cold attention hung over them both, patient, waiting, and Sorrel understood in a wordless way that it would take whichever life was offered up with a wooler heart, and that this had always been the true price. Not a life at all, but the willingness to open your fists and stop clutching. "I do not know how," Corvin said, and the words came apart in his mouth. "I have held on so long that I no longer know the way to stop." "Then hold on to me instead," Sorrel said, "and we will find the way together." And she reached through the hole and open bond, past him and north across all those cold and sleeping miles, to the ringing tower and the still woman and the small warm stone at her throat. She felt Corvin reach with her, felt his grief and her mercy braid together into a single strand, and for one terrible moment she felt him falter, felt his grip spasm shut again out of 3 winters of habit, felt the cold attention swing, sensing the flinch, back toward the warmer of the 2 lives in the ring. "No," Corvin gasped, and it was not a refusal now but a wrenching, a man tearing his own fingers open one at a time. "No, not her, never her." And he turned his face up to the pairing moon, and for the first time in 3 winters he said the words aloud that he had never once let himself say. "Goodbye, Vesna. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Rest now. I am letting you go." And he did. Together, with a whole heart and nothing at all held back, they opened their hands. Let her go, they told the moon, freely, wanting nothing, only let her rest. For one endless breath, there was nothing. Then, far to the north, the great stone in the locked tower rang out its last long note and shattered into silence. And Sorrel felt, down the length of the bond, the gentlest thing she had ever known, the soft settling of a soul that had been held too long from its rest at last coming quietly to ground. Vesna sighed once in her sleep 3 winters late, and was gone, and was at peace. And the cold presence over the ring of stones lifted all at once, the way a held breath is finally released, and went looking for its debt, and found that there was no longer any debt in all the world for it to find. It was over. Corvin gasped like a man breaking the surface of deep water. The gray seep that had hollowed him for weeks reversed itself all at once, color pouring back into his face, warmth into his hands, life flooding the bond that had so nearly gone dark, and he caught Sorrel hard against him, and held her until she could not breathe and did not in the least want to. "You are still here," she said, half laughing and half weeping, her hands moving over his warm and living face to be certain of it. "You stubborn, beautiful fool. You are still here. You argued the moon out of a debt," he said, wonder in his ruined voice. "I argued you out of a debt," she said. "The moon was easy work by comparison. You were always the harder bargain." He laughed, and the sound of it was cracked and wet, and the most alive thing she had ever heard. Then he pressed his mouth to her hair, to her brow, to the salt drying on her cheeks, as though he could not quite believe he was allowed to, which, after everything, he perhaps still could not. Through the bond wide open now, and no longer costing either of them anything at all, she felt it all wash back and forth between them, the grief and the vast relief, and beneath both, and at last, unshadowed, plain and enormous and free. "Say it," she whispered, "just once, with nothing at all hanging on it. I love you, Corvin said into her hair, in the gray of the coming light, owing the moon nothing. I love you. There. It costs nothing, now, and it is worth everything, and I mean to say it every morning I have left, which I intend to be a great many. They knelt together in the ring of leaning stones as the thin old moon set, and the first soft gray of dawn came up over the ruined valley of her childhood. Two people who had each been offered up as the price of someone else's grief, and had at the very last refused to let one another be spent. Far below, in the waking house, an old woman stood in a lit doorway and wept, though this time only for gladness. And to the north, in a silent tower where no one would ever again climb the stair by night, a gentle woman lay truly at rest, at last. A small, dark stone, cool and quiet against her throat. They rode north together when Corvin had his strength again, and it was nothing like the flight south had been. Word of the king's death had run ahead of them, seated by a smiling man who had counted on a widow, too frightened to ask how he came to be so certain of it. So when the king rode through his own gates alive, his Luna beside him and her bare hand in his, the court came out to see. What they had been promised could not happen, and stood very quiet, and did their sums. Lord Ferran did his fastest of all, and his smile arrived a half-beat too late to be believed. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing rather lower than he ever once had. "The joy of the whole court. We had feared the very worst." "You arranged the very worst," Sorrel said pleasantly, and pitched it to Carrie, under stripped banners, on the road to Lindenmere. "Not every man you sent came home, my lord. One of them was glad enough to trade a name for the keeping of his neck. It did not need to be true." She watched the color drain from him, and knew it had done the honest work of a truth. For a guilty man convicts himself in whatever silence you leave him. The elder houses will want the whole of it. I should think they are hearing it already. They were. Ferran was gone from Ashfell within the week, stripped of his seat and his lands, and shown the southern road. A woman who has everything can afford to be merciful. And that was the last thing the smiling man ever taught her. They buried Vesna in the spring, in the high meadow above the keep, where the moon-blooded dead of Ashfell were laid, the small moonstone cool and quiet on her breast. Corvin grieved her cleanly at last, the way the living are meant to grieve the dead, out loud and in the sunlight. And then, slowly, less. Sorrel grieved too, in her way, for the gentle woman she had never met, and had somehow come to know through the bond. There was no rivalry left in it, only two women a grieving man had loved, and one of them, at last allowed to rest. The crown of pale iron came back to Sorrel on a plain morning, with no feast, no horns, no watching faces. She had left it once on an empty bed at sunrise. The whole of her worth, as she had then believed it, sat down and walked away from Hay. This time Corvin brought it to her himself, and did not set it upon her head, but held it out on his two open hands, so that the taking of it was hers alone. "You left this behind once," he said. "I left a great many things behind that morning," she said. "Most of them I was right to leave." She looked at the cold circle of it lying in his warm and living hands, and then she took it up, and put it on herself, and found that it was only a crown now, a piece of a life she had chosen, not the price of anything at all. She did not forget Lindenmere. Grain went south to the green valley that had raised her, and masons after it, and by the second spring there was smoke again above the mill pond, and children in the orchard, where the drowned gardens had begun to grow. They had each been made a bargaining chip in someone else's grief, taught, early and hard, that love was a thing you held on to until your knuckles bled. The moon taught them better. Everything they had been most afraid to lose, they saved only by opening their hands, and everything they had never dared to hope for, they kept ever after by holding it gently, and never again by force. Thank you for listening. I hope this one stayed with you. Here is the thing I keep turning over. Corvin carried the truth alone for 3 winters, certain the knowing of it would destroy the woman he loved. Was that devotion, or only fear wearing devotion's coat? And would you have wanted the truth from the very first night? Whatever it cost, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I will see you in the next story.